Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for July 3rd, 2020. And today we're talking about Independence Day. But rather than talking about the Declaration of Independence, I want to focus, just because so many other people are going to be commenting on it, talking about it. You can read all about it all you want. But instead, I want to briefly highlight a few things that I think are passed over, missed, never taught, never read. A few other documents, two declarations, one from 1775, another one from 1776, July 2nd. And of course, I got to mention Thomas Paine and Samuel Adams. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Boldin. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find all the various platforms we're on, both video, live streaming, and archive, and then audio-only podcast edition on our show homepage. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty, all spelled out. So there you're going to find all those platforms. You're going to find all the archives of the show. We've been doing it for about 2 years now. Individual episodes. I have notes and links for stuff for you to read and watch and listen to and learn more and do more research on your own time. You can also find our email newsletter, our social media channels, and even ways to support us like our membership program, which is little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty. Look, I'm so grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a nice weekend planned for the Independence Day celebration, whatever it may be for you. But I promise to not take up too much of your time since it's Fast Friday. Let's see if I can get this done in the next 10 to 15 minutes. We'll see if I can do that. Anyways, I want to first start out with a declaration that few people talk about from the summer of 1775, actually July 6th, 1775, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity for Taking Up Arms. And here, just a quick overview. It was one of several addresses issued by Congress in the summer of 75 with the object of justifying to the American people and to the world the necessity for armed resistance. Notice it wasn't an armed attack. It wasn't an offensive war, which Paine, for example, was very much opposed to. It was defensive conflict and resistance. And the reason I pulled up this particular link is it talks about some really interesting history behind that. There was some debate for many years over the authorship of this. Some people thought it was one person or another, but it really was kind of a co-authorship between Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, who you know I talk about very regularly. And Jefferson actually did a draft, and some people would say that Jefferson was more the radical and Dickinson was kind of the moderate. But really, in some ways, when Dickinson revised it before the final publication that they approved, in some ways he was more severe, more aggressive. In other ways, he was more conservative. But it's really just an interesting history that I encourage you to read. I will include that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty. And I want to go through a few of the interesting pieces here talking about this particular document. They go through, like in the Declaration of Independence, they go through a list of the things that are problematic. They start out right at the beginning, and it was Dickinson talking about right at the beginning, basically talking about how, like, look, they're claiming the power to bind us in all cases whatsoever. They claim the power to do whatever they want, whenever they want. And he says basically, like, look, even if such a thing were acceptable, or this was such a thing, no one's ever given us any evidence that you actually have this power. So here are some of the problems that we have. For example, they have undertaken to give and grant our money without our consent, though we have ever exercised an exclusive right to dispose of our own property. They deprived us of the accustomed and inestimable privilege of trial by jury in cases affecting both life and liberty, life and property. Suspending the legislature of one of the colonies, talking about Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Government Act, one of the intolerable acts. Altering fundamentally the form of government established by that charter and secured by acts of its own legislature. They erected in a neighboring province acquired by the joint arms of Great Britain and America, a despotism dangerous to our very existence. Of course, they quartered soldiers upon the colonists in time of profound peace. And this I thought was really interesting. Every time I read through this, I'm like, wow, this is really serious. He says, why, and I'm not sure who wrote this sentence here, but why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? Like, here are some of the major things that are wrong. Here are some of the major problems and why we have to fight back. But why do we even have to do this? Again, by one statute, it is declared that Parliament can, quote, of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. This is unlimited arbitrary despotism is what it is. And they go on, they say, we for 10 years, they were doing this for even longer than that, but for 10 years, incessantly and ineffectually besieged the throne as supplicants. We reasoned, we remonstrated with Parliament, I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong, in the most mild and decent language. They were acting as good subjects of the crown. They begged, they pleaded, they sent petitions, they used proper language, they were courteous, they stated their points, but they were never treated with the respect and the rights that they deserved. And of course, what they're talking about in this is the Declaratory Act of 1766. It asserted that Parliament had the absolute power to make laws and changes to the colonial government in all cases whatsoever. That's specifically in all cases whatsoever. This was a serious, serious issue. This Declaratory Act of 1766. Going further, they're talking about General Gage. He made an unprovoked assault on the inhabitants at the town of Lexington. From thence, the troops proceeded in warlike array to the town of Concord. And I'm just reading through little highlights. For those of you who aren't watching, I'm not reading every word of this, but see, there's some of the highlights talking about General Gage. And of course, his troops have butchered our countrymen, have wantonly burnt Charlestown, besides a considerable number of houses and other places. Our ships and vessels are seized, the necessary supplies of provisions are intercepted, and he is exerting his utmost power to spread destruction and devastation around him. And they talk about how they have a just cause, a perfect union, great internal resources. I think maybe that they're selling other countries on the idea like, look, we're going to handle this. But I think they also recognize that they were going to need some help against the largest empire in world history at that point. But this near the end really sums it up, I think says such a great deal. In our native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed to the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before. Again, John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson on the necessity of taking up arms against the British. But that leads me to the fact that this was not a Declaration of Independence. They were actually reasserting that they weren't going to do that at this time. We're just fighting back, standing up for our rights, for our property, for our lives, and the like. But things kept building up. It didn't actually change. In fact, it got worse. And of course, we know that in January of 1776, the following year, we get Common Sense published by Thomas Paine. That was January 10th, 1776, when it was first published. And for many years, and it may still be today, the most widely published pamphlet in American history. It was just 48 pages, and this from an article by Dave Benner, who does so much great work on history for us and for other organizations and websites. But he points out that there were a number of powerful arguments that Thomas Paine made in that 48 short pages. I'm just going to highlight a few of them here. Rights were naturally bestowed and pre-existed government. 2, the legitimate government depends on the consent of the governed. Again, that's a phrase, and Paine wasn't the first to make that either, but this really, really became popularized through Common Sense. He said that the incendiary British policy toward the colonies had violated the colonial charters and the British constitutional system itself. Dave points out that Paine made the case that the British claim to the right to bind the colonies again in all cases whatsoever. And Paine thought it was so important that he brought it up again in December of 76 in the American Crisis. I think it was the first one that he published, saying like, look, you can't give up now because they still have this thing on the books saying that they can bind us in all cases whatsoever. So it is do or die at this point. Of course, that a free people could withdraw from an illegitimate government as such a government ceased to possess the ability to demand compliance. And Dave points out that Paine wasn't the first to make this. Others like Jefferson, James Otis, James Iredell, many others had all articulated, Dave writes, similar ideas in the years prior. But many of their arguments were coded in legalese and historical references that may have been unfamiliar to typical colonists. It was Paine's work, therefore, that struck the greatest chord with the everyday American. So at that point, once that started spreading around, there were a lot more calls for independence from the general public. But Congress actually wasn't authorized to do this. There were 13 different governments and different representatives, and they did not have express authorization to even do this. So during that time, a bunch of resolutions, I think it was, there were dozens and dozens of resolutions in support of independence, like the Halifax Resolves in April for North Carolina, explicitly being the first one to explicitly authorize their delegation to Congress to actually be in support of separation of independence. But there were dozens of them between April and July of 1776, but really most of them were overshadowed by the beginning of July. And I think, of course, the real important one that we miss was on July 2nd, 1776. And here again, another article from Dave Benner. He writes that the Second Continental Congress passed the Lee Resolution from Richard Henry Lee, which called for ties between Great Britain and the American states to be totally dissolved. That was the phrase they used. The ties were, quote, totally dissolved. That was the original Independence Day. And in fact, John Adams, in a letter to Abigail, he specifically said that he expected generations to come to be celebrating July 2nd with festivals and the like. He was off by a couple of days, but pretty close. Following the agitation in Boston, Dave writes, Britain dissolved the autonomy of the Massachusetts government, going back to the Intolerable Acts again, closed Boston's port, imposed a quartering law, and besieged the colony. And despite the prospect of death by hanging, they still passed the resolution. They knew they were in serious business here. And this is how Mercy Otis Warren put it. I just want to read it just because it just is so powerful. They call her the muse of the American Revolution. She says, their transactions might have been legally styled treasonable. And of course, we can think back, just a quick aside, we can think back to Patrick Henry's great "If This Be Treason" speech in response to the Stamp Act. Their transactions might have been legally styled treasonable, but loyalty had lost its influence and power its terrors. You push too far, and sooner or later, that has no impact. People will resist. Warren goes on. She says, firm and disinterested, intrepid and united, they stood ready to submit to the chances of war and to sacrifice their devoted lives to preserve inviolate and to transmit to posterity the inherent rights of men, conferred on all by the God of nature, and the privileges of Englishmen claimed by Americans from the sacred sanctions of compact. And that was the Lee Resolution, July 2nd, 1776. I encourage you to read this short post from Dave Benner. At the bottom of it, we have the full text of the resolution. It is pretty short. It's 3 different sections calling on 3 different things, but first starting out with this phrase that all political connection between them, these independent, free and independent states, and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. One other thing that I want to mention is a speech given by the great Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, on August 1st, 1776. And you might be thinking like, oh, August 1st? What's going on August 1st? What, we've got July 2nd now, July 4th. What happened? Well, first of all, the Declaration wasn't even signed till August 2nd. And so Samuel Adams came out and gave a very long speech in front of Independence Hall, I believe, on August 1st in support. And there's some great quotes from it that I think we're all familiar with. I want to read two of them, one that I know you've probably heard at some point, just to close this out. First of all, if ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude than the animating contest of freedom. Go from us in peace. We ask not your counsels or arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. And the way Adams closed it out, I think, was so powerful. He put it this way: for my own part, I ask no greater blessing than to share with you the common danger and common glory. If I have a wish dearer to my soul than that my ashes may be mingled with those of a Warren and Montgomery, it is that these American states may never cease to be free and independent. Samuel Adams may have been the original 10ther. What an awesome speech. I will link to the whole text of that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was fun to watch. It was interesting and educational. Most of all, I hope you learned something. I hope you have some nice plans for this Independence Day weekend. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. Of course, if you support the show and you want to help us out, you can help us spread the word with some free, easy, just a few seconds of actions online. Smash the like button, subscribe, get bell notifications on YouTube, leave us a review on places like iTunes or other podcast platforms. Leave some comments, whether live or in the archive. I read through all of them. I don't get a chance to reply to all of them, but I do my best to keep on top of them, and I get a lot of great ideas for follow-up episodes from your feedback. And of course, if you want to support us financially, it means so much to me. If you'll consider that, please do not feel obligated to do so. But if you are able to, you can pitch in for as little as $2 a month, joining us as a member over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Or if you prefer to do a one-time donation rather than joining up, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, thank you so much for being here with me today. Have a wonderful Independence Day weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.